Hello, today we are going to sew a 1950s cotton day dress using the Liesl's party dress pattern. So this pattern is inspired by The Sound of Music, and I have the original model garment that I made for this pattern. And as you can see, this version is very detailed. It has pearl embroidery, it has neckline puffing, which is sheer, and then it has puffing at the sleeves as well. So the Liesl's party dress pattern is very authentic to early 1940s. The film was supposed to be set in the late 1930s, but by making just a couple of tweaks to the pattern, you can arrive at a very authentic 1950s look. And I'd like to show you a few examples of what I'm referring to. So this was a 1950s day dress made in cotton by McCall's magazine for Miss America in the 50s. And you can see there are so many similarities to this pattern. So you have two sets of darts in the bodice, you have a slightly gathered skirt, you have a ribbon around the waist which is tied into some sort of a bow, and then you have neckline puffing. So that's how we're going to do it in the version today. Is the neck puffing is not going to be sheer, it is going to be made from the same cotton fabric the rest of the dress is made from, which is going to give you a little more coverage, and it's also going to make it a much simpler project. So here is another example of a pattern from the 1950s that is very similar. You have your fitted simple bodice with the two sets of darts, and then you have the self fabric puffing at the neck, and this version has a belt and opts for a circular skirt instead of gathered. And then here's something similar as well from the 50s. This version has pleats in the skirt and a lace or plain cotton band instead of a puffed one. And then finally, here is a prom version, a 1950s junior evening gown version where you have your full skirt, you have what looks like a detached cummerbund, and then you have the ruched self fabric band at the neckline. So here is the material that I've selected for this project today. It's 100% cotton. The pattern is available on edelweisspatterns.com. It comes in digital or paper format. The paper format, it ships within 24 hours, but it can take 2 to 7 business days depending on the shipping method you choose. If you're needing it sooner, the digital download can print at your house immediately, like instantly as soon as you purchase it. So I am excited to share this with you today. This is a style which will work if you have sewn a couple of projects before. I would consider it intermediate, on the lower level of intermediate, or maybe like an advanced beginner. So we are going to go lay out the pattern and start cutting. Okay, so the only noticeable difference between this and the pattern is going to be the fact that I'm lining the bodice. So I've just cut out the bodice pieces front and back out of a basic cotton fabric, and we're going to flat line, which means you put the lining underneath the wrong side of the fashion fabric, and we're going to stitch all the way around the perimeter. So that is essentially going to combine them into one piece of fabric. And again, this is called flat lining. It's a lot different than typical lining because with a regular lining, you would essentially create two different bodices and then stitch them together. And this way, it is the simple way to line it. So now you can see I have pinned the bodice lining to the bodice back pieces all the way around the perimeter, and we're just going to go ahead and stitch as we did a minute ago. And once those pieces are stitched, we are going to follow the instructions, which says to start out with the darts. And if you guys have followed me for a while, you know I love tea. So I don't do really much of anything without drinking tea. This one here that I am drinking is Wedding Tea by Harney & Sons. It is just so refreshing. It's a white tea, so it's very delicate, and it has lemon and rosebud and I think vanilla flavors. So what I'm demonstrating now is how to mark your darts. Marking darts can be hard, especially if you are using tissue paper patterns because they tend to rip. So here, whether you print the patterns off or whether you have them sent to your house, our patterns come on standard white paper, so they're not going to fall apart. So what I've done is I've just cut out the darts in the size that I am sewing, and now I folded the bodice front in half, and I'm I'm just notching where the darts are going to start with my scissors. And now I have unfolded the bodice front again, and I'm starting at the apex of the dart with one pin, and the little top of the glass head is where the stitching will stop. And then I'm filling in the rest of the dart with pins along the sides. Then, once it's all marked, you're going to fold it in half and replace the pins so that there's only one set of pins and not two sets, not one on the front and the back. So here you can see all 4 of the darts on the bodice front are marked. We start at the widest end of the dart and we go towards the point of the dart, and once we get to the point we are going to backstitch to make sure that it stays really nice and secure. So it's really important when you're sewing to get a lot of good steam into any new seam or dart that you're sewing. It makes a tremendous difference in how it looks and how it wears in the years to come. So once I press it flat, we are pressing it to the side, and then I'm going to turn it around to the right side of the garment and press as well. Now for pressing the darts in the front, it's going to be a little trickier because the front darts, they just are naturally wider and deeper than bodice back darts. So I'm using the tailor's ham for this purpose, and it just gives you a nice shaped area to be able to press on. So the next step is going to be the side seams. So we're putting the bodice front and bodice back pieces together at the side seams and pinning in place. And now we're just going to use a regular 5/8 inch seam allowance. Making sure to backstitch at the front and end of the seam. So now we want to trim down the seam allowances a little bit. I'm just taking them down to about 3/8 of an inch. Now this is a very important step. Here what I'm doing is what I call the 5-step pressing method. There's an article tutorial on the Edelweiss Patterns blog that I will link below in case you'll want to read it. But essentially, step 1 is you press it flat, step 2 is you press it open from the wrong side, step 3 is you press it open from the right side, step 4 is you press it towards the side from the wrong side. So in this case, side seam allowances always get pressed towards the back. And then the final step, step number 5, you press it again from the right side of the garment. So now we want to use a zigzag stitch to finish off those raw edges. So I'm setting it to a very wide and very short zigzag. So our bodice is now predominantly put together. We can go ahead and put that aside for a minute. And I'm pointing out here that we do not need to do the lower sleeve puffing, because in this version, this is the 1950s version, there will be no puffing at the lower sleeve, which is going to make your job much easier when you're sewing this. But we still do want that upper cap sleeve. Now, the lower edge is usually attached to the sleeve puffing, but in this case we need to hem it because, again, it has to be finished. So I have marked the 5/8 inch point. This is the edge that would usually be taken up in the seam with the lower sleeve puffing. I'm just going to finger press it, which is just essentially folding it along those pin lines. It's a good way to make sure you're going to have it accurate before you press it in place. And now I'm tucking under that raw edge and pinning in place. Now, once this hem has been sewn, whether you choose to do that by machine or by hand, we need to stitch these sleeves into the bodice. So you can see here which is the back and which is the front. And we're going to match the top of the sleeves with the top of the bodice edges. So here we're stitching it into the back bodice arm's eye. And then we're going to go ahead and pin with the right sides together. And repeat that on the other side as well. So now we're going to go ahead and stitch each of those 4 seams. It's a very fast seam. Then we will press it and finish the raw edges. So here's what it looks like when all of the seams are pressed and finished. Now we need to cap off that lower arm's eye with our bias binding that we already purchased for the project. So it's really quite simple. You're just going to open it up and fold under a little bit at the top so that you don't have any raw edges coming out. And then just fold that middle fold over the raw edge of the fabric to encase it and pin it in place. And again, you can do this either by hand or by machine. So the bodice is starting to come together. You can see the next step is to add the puffing. So we're going to stitch the puffing together, the neckband front together at the side seams. So we're just joining the neckband front to the 2 neckband backs. Again, a basic 5/8 inch seam allowance. And once those seams are finished being sewn, again we trim them down, we press them, we finish the raw edges with zigzag or overlock. And now, according to the instructions, we are placing a row of gathering stitches along one edge of the band. And we're just going to gather that up until that whole edge is ruffled. Now, following the instructions, we want to stitch that gathered edge into the top of the bodice. So we're going to match up the back openings, and then you want to find the side seam on that neckband puffing and match up that side seam right in the middle of the little cap sleeve. And once you have those two things matched up, you can distribute evenly the remainder of the ruffles in between the back opening and the side of the cap sleeve. Now we're going to go over to the other side, again find that side seam where we joined the front and back ruffle, pin that right down the center of this sleeve, and then match up the end of the ruffle with the other side of the bodice back opening. And just keep pinning and distributing until it is all in. And now it's not stitched yet, but I wanted to give you a little sneak peek of what it's going to look like. So we're going to take it off the mannequin and go stitch it with a typical 5/8 inch seam allowance. And now we have a row of gathering stitches along the top edge of the neck band, and we are gathering that up as well. Now before we finish that ruffle off, I am top stitching from the exterior of the garment with a contrasting thread, and this is just going to keep the seam allowances down towards the bodice. Okay, so at this point you want to try it on yourself and make sure that the top gathering line is pulled up enough. You want to make sure it's really snug so that it doesn't gape at all when you're wearing it. So following the instructions, we want to open up our 1/4 inch double fold bias binding and put it along the edge of the puffing. Now I'm not putting this exactly at the edge, I'm putting this to where that first fold, which is the one we will be stitching through on our machine, basically lines up with the gathering stitches. So, you know, there's a row of gathering stitches along the top. We don't want the threads from that gathering row to show through. So that's why you see that the binding is a little bit to the left of the edge. And we will just go ahead and cut off any excess now that it's stitched. So we're going to press that really well, and then we're going to fold it in to the inside of the garment. So initially we're just steaming along that seam we just sewed. We don't want to flatten the binding too much at this point because we still need to keep the original folds from the factory for the next step. So we're now going to fold the bias binding to the inside, but keeping half of it visible from the outside. So when you're looking at the garment on the outside, you will see a tiny little bit of white binding, and that's going to give it a very clean finish. Now because this binding is so narrow, I'm not even using pins, I'm just hand turning it little by little as I go, and you're going to find that a lot simpler. So we have a really nice professional finish at the top neck edge of our garment. And now, according to the sewing instructions, it's time to assemble the skirt. So I did not manage to get actual sewing footage. I thought I had. Essentially, you're going to pin the skirt gores together at the side seams, stitch, trim, press, zigzag. That's how it works. And once all of those gores are stitched together at the side seams, you just have a really simple, straightforward skirt. And what we're doing here, and you'll see this in the instructions, is we are gathering the top edge of the skirt because it's wider than the bodice, so it just needs to be pulled up to fit into the lower bodice edge. In this case, I am choosing to use a second row of stitches because if you have a lot of material to gather, it is going to give you a better appearance if you have used 2 rows instead of just 1 row of gathering stitches. I'm pulling up the 2 bobbin threads at the same time, and you just start to pull the fabric along those threads until the fabric is evenly distributed. So this is what it's going to look like, more or less. I just had to try it on the mannequin. So now we're just going to pin it in place. So up here on the top is the bodice, the lower portion is the skirt. I am folding the skirt in half because I want to find center front. Once I find center front, I'm marking it with a pin. And then we're going to do the same thing with the lower bodice edge. We're folding it in half, making sure we find where center front is, and pinning that as well. Now we're going to put the bodice and the skirt together with right sides together, and we're going to match up those 2 pins that we just marked. And this ensures that the gathers are where they need to be because it will be better distributed that way. And once you have matched up center front and the back edges, you just distribute the rest of the gathers evenly and pin in place until it all looks nice and smooth. Now usually they say you should sew gathered fabric with the gathers underneath so the feed dogs can help to press them through. There are so many gathers in this dress, I would rather see them facing me just so I can make sure that there are no tucks that get formed. So now that that is stitched, we are trimming away the excess in the seam allowances. And now we're going to get some good steam in that seam and just press it really well. Once you've pressed it flat, you can press it open. And then we are going to press both edges of the seam allowance down toward the skirt. And I'm finishing this seam as we finish all the other seams. And now the interior is all finished and we are ready to put in our zipper. Now it's worth noting the instructions. I believe they call for an invisible zipper. This cotton day dress, it's fine to use a regular standard metal zipper. We're just going to measure from the top to the part where the zipper stop is, which comes out to 22 inches on this one. Now I'm going to measure from the top 22 inches down and put a pin there. This is going to represent where the zipper needs to stop. So the reason why we're doing this is because we're going to stitch this entire seam from the top of the bodice down to the bottom of the skirt, but we're only going to use long basting stitches from the top all the way down to the portion where the zipper is going to stop. So you can see here we are matching up the seam allowances. We just want to make sure that that comes out clean. So everything is neatly pinned now. And again, that pin that's sideways there, that is the mark at which we will stop using basting stitches and we will change the machine setting to regular 2.5. But right now we are about to start from the top, so I have the machine set to the longest stitch setting. Okay, so there's that pin. This is where the zipper is going to stop. So I'm changing the setting, and now we will just do a regular stitch all the way down to the bottom of the skirt. Okay, and we're just double checking that those seams came out good. So we're just going to press this very well because this is an important seam and we want to take our time, make sure it's pressed very nicely. We pressed it flat and now we're pressing it open. For this point, I have put the tailor's hem underneath to give us an easier way to press the upper portion of the seam. So we're just finishing that raw edge. We're going to do that on both sides of that seam. So now we need to pin the zipper in place. And the way that I do it does take a little bit extra work, but it's going to be worth it in the long run, because if you have just started sewing and you're putting zippers in, zippers have a reputation for being a finicky thing. It can be easy to get them off center, and this method will ensure that it comes out looking really nice every time. So what we're doing is we are pinning the zipper, and I have put a tailor's ham underneath to make it easier to manipulate the garment at this point in time. We're just centering the little plastic teeth of the zipper right in the middle of that seam. I also want to point out, you'll see these little pieces of the zipper tape up at the top that are sticking out. We don't need to press those down just yet until we're pinning from the right side of the garment. So that's why there's a little bit extra at the top. So this is not hard, it just takes precision. Once you have it pinned all the way to the zipper stop, we want to turn that garment to the right side out. And we're going to start by folding under the little edges of the tape that I showed you first. We want to fold them under so that there's nothing popping out from the top of the garment. And what we're going to do is use pins on either side of the zipper. And as we pin on the right side, we can pull out the pins that we initially pinned on the inside. And you can see it's just perfectly parallel lines all the way down the middle on either side of that seam. And we do want to put a pin very prominently so we don't miss it at the bottom of the zipper, because we're going to need to stitch like a couple little right angles. So I'm putting in my zipper foot. I'm going to remove the regular one. A zipper foot is really helpful because you can use it on the right or left of the zipper. I'm also taking off this part of my machine to make it easier. You can see with my fingers I'm kind of showing you where the zipper is. You can feel when you're sewing exactly where the zipper is to make sure that you're on the right track. We're going to do this slowly. We just keep going a little bit at a time. Now we do have that pin still in place, and when we get to it we are going to pivot. Okay, so this is where we want to lift the presser foot, rotate the fabric 90 degrees, stitch across for about an inch, maybe half an inch. I'm walking this across. I'm not using my pedal, I'm walking it with the hand wheel. And then we're back stitching. And now we're going to repeat the same process on the other side of the zipper. And when we get to the end, this time we do not need to pivot because we already made that little stitch across on the left side. So we can just stitch all the way to that line that we sewed at the bottom of the zipper and back stitch, and we're good to go. So now what we want to do is pull out those basting threads. So remember, the basting threads ran from the top of the zipper to where the bottom of the zipper is supposed to be. So you're going to use your seam ripper and then pull out the little threads that appear with a pair of tweezers. And once you do that all the way down to the bottom of the zipper, just test it a couple times, zip and unzip to make sure there are no threads that are going to get caught. Now going back to the instructions, you can see there are these little loops that are recommended for the model garment. We don't need to do that for this version because again that band, the neckband, is made of cotton, so that's not necessary. The next thing to do is to finish the hem and press it up. So I'm starting by zigzagging around the entire circumference of the lower skirt edge. So we have a really nice finish, and now we want to put in a row of gathering stitches towards the bottom. This is a vintage technique. Back then they used to hem skirts that were very wide and full, a lot wider than what we're used to sewing and wearing today. And the way they would do it is they would finish the raw edge, they would put a little bit of gathering towards the bottom, and this enabled them to have a wider skirt match the slightly narrower part to which it was being hemmed, if that makes sense, because we're pressing it up about 3 inches. We're not going to gather very much, just a very little bit, and then we're going to press up 3 inches, and we want to do the pressing first from the edge towards the upper part of the skirt, and I'll demonstrate that more in a minute. But once we have all 3 inches pressed up, you can either choose to hem it by hand or by machine. It will look better if you stitch it by hand. It will obviously take a lot longer. I like to hand hem. I like to do that when I'm watching a show or I have music going. And then once it's all stitched, it's going to look so nice on the inside. You can see it's very neatly finished. Like I was saying earlier, you want to press from the hem edge up. That's going to shrink in the fullness. The next step that the dress is done is to wear this with a petticoat. If you're going for a 50s look, the petticoat is going to give you that nice poof. It's going to give you a proper silhouette. I did a poll on Instagram whether to use a sage green ribbon or a peach ribbon, and overwhelmingly most suggested green, but you can see I did tie in the peach chiffon roses. I made those from our couture rose pattern. I am reading one of Maria von Trapp's books, which is fantastic. I will leave it linked below. As you can see, this cotton dress is perfect for summer. You could also make it this way in taffeta with the self fabric puffing at the neckline. I would love if you would subscribe to our email newsletter. It has lots of inspiration coming. There will be new patterns as well. But for now, I should say so long, farewell. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.